In my studio, I mix about 10 pounds of the clear glaze formula, and then I subdivide it into smaller batches and mix maybe 2,000 grams of yellow and 2,000 grams of green, and then maybe something like a half a cup of cobalt blue. And all those colorants and their amounts are on the glaze handout that'll be included with the DVD. And then I just mix and match. So now I'm using a different brush, and I'm going to start painting in these leaves. And I will try to do 3 coats of green on each leaf. If I go over the lines, I will scrape it off later when it's dry with a bamboo skewer. It's much easier to clean it up when it's dry than when it's wet. And if I have any frustration in my process, it's that too often I find myself reapplying glaze after the first glaze firing because I'm not satisfied. And part of that issue is coming from the fact that all of this Sgraffito in the shrinking and the firing, it can be less smooth than I want it to be when it comes out of the kiln. Then I will put more glaze on and I can fire it. And having said that, it's interesting that working with red earthenware and my glazes, I can fire glaze and bisque together in the same kiln, which is a nice plus. I have one glaze on the glaze handout that I don't do that with, and that is the amber glaze. And that glaze can bubble if it doesn't have just a lot of oxygen. And I think of it as somewhat temperamental, and so I always fire it in just a glaze kiln and with a lot of room around the objects that have the amber glaze on them. This green glaze, getting down into the dark lines of the piece, that's really what I want to do, because the rutile will fill in those lines, because I'm going to paint the rutile glaze over the top of everything. It will fill in those lines. And in the course of doing that, they no longer read as black. So I will actually scrunch that down in there. And then if they don't read as black, what I do is another firing, because I want them to be black. And I do a China paint firing, a water-based China paints are what I use. And I go back and feed the black back into those lines. So it's nicer if I just get in there. And one way to do that is to almost paint this with water first and get down in there. Now that that green glaze is applied, three coats everywhere, and I need it to dry just a little bit to scrape off little smears here and there, I will do the border, and the border is going to be my ubiquitous black dots. Then I will try to do a shortened version of some background that I paint behind these leaves. And it's just a white on white dotting. I tend to do dots about half this size, maybe like the smaller ones, but I'll just do more like some larger polka dots. And it's just, and again, this is a Amico Velvet Underglaze white. It's going to be a different color white than the background of this plate, especially since I must have used a sponge that had some iron in it. I still see some residue of iron oxide down in there from wiping this off, which I'll leave. I'll pour a little bit in the lid. I like using the lid because it's small and shallow, and it allows me to be faster than if I have to dip down into the... And I kind of collect brushes when I visit a big city. If I pass an art supply store, I'll go in. This brush comes from a really wonderful art supply store on the King's Road in London. But just the other day, I also went and bought a bunch of brushes at Hobby Lobby. These big polka dots, which I've never done before against these leaves, I think has the chance of making me pretty happy once it's done. Now this piece needs to just dry for a while, which I already mentioned. There's little smears of the green that I want to just scrape off, and I'm going to come back when the black is done and just put a few red dots throughout this outside border, and the white dots need to dry. And then what will happen is, this is my glaze, my clear glaze with 8% rutile in it, and I will just paint that all over the top of everything inside this black and white border. This black and white border will get painted with commercial clear glaze, and that's again just to have this contrast. The border is going to be a more brittle sheen or shine, and this will be a softer sheen. So this has now dried long enough. Nothing is shiny, and that's usually my benchmark for thinking the next layer of something can go on. I have a few little smears of this green beyond the line, and so I'm going to just remove it. I have a little dot that just landed here. It'll probably never go all the way away unless I get in there with a sponge, especially up near the points of the leaf. I want it nice and crisp as possible. But I thought back here I would just demonstrate how I sometimes treat the back of work, and it gives me a chance to talk about this brush. Mine is slightly falling apart, and what I'll do, it's unwinding from I made a mistake and let it sit in water too long, but when I get home I'll just dip this in candle wax from here up and it'll just push it all back together. But this is a auto body pinstriping brush. They're called daggers. And the reason, and they're fabulous to use, in certain ways I believe the brush that's going to give the really expressive mark is the brush you can't control. And that's what happens with this. I load this up with material, in this case just my black slip, and it's weighty, flops, and it gives me the potential to do thin and thick lines. So I'm just going to do a little brushwork on the back, and the back will have clear glaze on it, either commercial or my own, because I've started on the other side and I'm just wrap it around to the bottom. I just think they make a beautiful mark. So that just gives, again, a little bit of perk to the backside for the dishwasher. And then they're offset by this kind of brush, which is super cheap, $1.99 at Hobby Lobby, which is a Chinese bamboo brush. They come, you can buy them this wide and just break them into segments. They're very useful, and they're what I'll use to do this glazing. So you will notice I wet the brush. You always want to wet a brush before you are going to load it up with anything, because it won't load up unless capillary action can pull the medium into the bristles. So I'm just following the line of that border. I'm not worried if I go under the line or over the line that much. If I have a little divot or a little hole or a place where I didn't see a line got filled in, I make sure it gets filled in. This seems like good glaze application. I don't worry about the fact that the outside border has two what they call flowing coats of commercial glaze on it, because that glaze is going to work with just two coats. I'm just pressing down a little bit of glaze that lifted up when I held the piece upside down in my hand to do the back. And I feel that with the bottom wiped off, that it's ready for the kiln.